Watch as an $80,000 luxury SUV gets crushed into a metal cube in just minutes. The sound? Pure satisfaction. My grandfather stood there with the calmest smile, like he had just finished a crossword puzzle on a peaceful Sunday. But here's the twist: this wasn't just any SUV. That was the beloved ride of our neighborhood HOA president. And she had no clue it was about to become a shiny 3-foot cube. When you cross the wrong 72-year-old Navy vet, well, things get interesting. Let me know where you're tuning in from, because this neighborhood feud just turned into full-blown warfare. And someone's about to discover that revenge tastes best when it's served flattened. I'm Danny Rodriguez. 3 months ago, after my divorce, I moved back in with my father Frank. Frank Rodriguez had been running Rodriguez Scrap and Metal Works in Willowbrook Heights for 3 decades. It was a peaceful suburb, once known for minding its own business. Our 2-acre lot held our family home, Frank's workshop, and rows of carefully sorted scrap he'd turn into income for local builders. But this place was about more than buzziness. It meant everything to my son, Tyler. Since the divorce, Tyler's autism symptoms had worsened. He was overwhelmed, shut down, and disconnected. Then something beautiful happened. He began spending time in Grandpa's shop. He'd take scraps and turn them into breathtaking sculpture pieces he named Hope, Surviving, feelings that lie via his way of expressing emotions he couldn't say out loud. Frank guided him with patience, often telling him, every piece of metal has a story. Our job is to give them new life. That quiet life shattered when Carmen Blackwood showed up. She pulled up in a spotless white Mercedes, wearing a designer suit probably worth more than most people's rent. Carmen had just been elected president of the HOA, and she took that role as seriously as a presidential campaign. She stepped out like she owned the street, her heels crunching down our gravel driveway as she scanned Frank's property with clear disapproval. This special child shouldn't be around dangerous equipment, she said, watching Tyler carefully arrange metal pieces into a sculpture. It's not Safia for him or for the other kids in the area. Frank stepped between them. His name is Tyler, and he's perfectly safe here, ma'am. Her look turned sharp. I don't care what his name is. This junkyard is dragging down property values across the board. She went on to explain that Sunset Development Corp had offered to buy the land for a luxury wellness center that would benefit the entire neighborhood. Frank calmly walked into his office and came back with a folder. Mrs. Blackwood, this shop has operated legally for 30 years. We're protected under grandfathered rights that existed well before your HOA did. She barely glanced at the documents, brushing them off. I don't recognize outdated permissions. New HOA, new rules. You've got 30 days to shut down or face a $500 daily fine. Our neighbor Susan Walsh, a lawyer, had overheard everything from her garden. She came over and cut in. Mrs. Blackwood, city law prohibits an HOA from canceling legal protections for businesses that existed before the HOA was established. What you're proposing isn't just wrong, it's illegal. Carmen's face turned crimson, but she kept her cool. Laws can change. Mr. Rodriguez, you have 30 days. I recommend you start packing. Tyler had been listening, anxiety creeping into his face. His hands began to tremble, the sign that he was overwhelmed. He tugged Frank's sleeve and asked softly, Grandpa, do I have to leave? Did I do something wrong? Frank got down to his level and put a comforting hand on his shoulder. No, son, you didn't do anything wrong. This isn't just about Landa, it's about protecting the one place where you feel completely safe. You're the most precious thing I've ever had the honor to help heal. I remembered the first time Tyler ever spoke here, right here in this very workshop. He pointed to a piece of scrap and said, Daddy, this is pretty. It was the first time he had ever initiated communication, and it happened under Frank's steady guidance. In the heart of the scrapyard, as Carmen's car disappeared down the road, Frank stood quietly in the driveway, his eyes filled with a mix of resolve and something else. Anticipation. He slowly walked to the metal crusher, running a calloused hand along its panel. What are you thinking about, Grandpa? Tyler asked innocently. Frank's smile was soft, but his eyes were steely. Just wondering what high-end metal sounds like when it's crushed. In 30 years of scrapping, I've never had the pleasure of recycling something premium. He folded the stack of violation notices and tucked them into his pocket, Some folks think they can crush everything good in this world with money and rules, but they forget us sometimes. What gets crushed only comes back stronger. Carmen didn't stop. She came at us like a tactical operation. Violation notices began flooding in almost daily. The first hit just 3 days after her visit. A $500 fine for industrial activity in a residential area despite our license saying otherwise. Then came the petty citations. A $100 fine for grass that measured 1.8 inches instead of the new 1.5-inch maximum. A $200 noise complaint filed because Tyler was gently tapping pieces of metal together in the afternoon. Susan immediately challenged the absurd noise complaint. City noise ordinances clearly stated that restrictions only applied between 9 p.m. and 7 o'clock a.m. But Carmen didn't care. This wasn't about safety or rules. This was harassment dressed in HOA policy. She came armed with a binder so thick it could stop a bullet full of updated community standards that seemed to grow heavier each week. One day, it was a $300 fine for having a minor unsupervised in an industrial zone. The next, $250 for improper storage of recyclable materials, even though Frank's scrap metal piles were organized better than most garages. But the real damage wasn't financial. Every time Carmen's white Mercedes rolled into the neighborhood, Tyler froze. His hands trembled. He'd stop working on his sculptures and hide behind Frank, paralyzed with fear. One day, we found a note folded inside one of his metal birds. It read, "This place is my home." The boy who had finally found safety, his voice, his PCA was watching it all being dismantled, one fine at a time. My anger was boiling. But my father stayed infuriatingly calm, and somehow, that made it worse. "Dad, we can't keep letting her terrorize Tyler," I said one night, after another one of his panic attacks. Frank looked up from his paperwork, his eyes colder than steel. "Son," he said quietly, "some things in this world are unforgivable, but patience is a broken bar. Patience is a weapon most people never learn to wield." Carmen escalated again. She began holding emergency home meetings at 6 a.m. on Mondays, giving only 18 hours notice by email. That was a direct violation of their own bylaws, which required a minimum 72-hour notice. Susan Walsh, ever the watchdog, printed out the charter and highlighted every line. "This is enough to invalidate any decision made in those meetings," she told Frank. But Carmen was clever. She only needed just enough nervous, compliant neighbors to show up and nod. And they did. At one of those rigged meetings, she passed something called the Child Safety Ordinance, banning anyone under 18 from being in industrial zones during business hours. When Antonio Garcia, owner of the local grocery store, dared to raise an objection, Carmen turned her focus on him like a heat-seeking missile. "Mr. Garcia," she said coolly, "I've noticed some zoning concerns around your storefront. Perhaps we should talk about them separately." Fear worked better than any rule. Ray Thompson stood outside that meeting, silent but shaken. He'd watched Tyler being forced to leave his safe space, his entire body shaking, and something inside him cracked. Ray had a 14-year-old son, David, who also had autism. Seeing Tyler in pain brought back too many memories. That night, Ray sat in his car outside the small church, recording a voice memo he never sent. "David, your dad is helping destroy a place where a kid like you finds peace, and I don't know how to live with that." Carmen's other enforcer, Blake Morrison, noticed the shift in Ray. "You going soft on me, Thompson?" Blake muttered. "Don't forget who signs our paychecks." Meanwhile, Frank's plan was starting to take shape, but only for those who knew how to read between the lines. He was documenting everything, complying with every absurd regulation, studying Carmen's patterns like an old Navy mechanic disassembling a faulty engine. He installed new security cameras claiming it was for Tyler's safety, and quietly, he started digging into Carmen Blackwood's past. One night, I asked why he hadn't fought back yet. His reply sent a chill through me. "I'm not angry, son," he said. "I'm measuring. I once repaired warships that had been ripped apart by enemy fire, but Tyler is the most valuable thing I've ever been trusted to protect, and I won't let anyone hurt him." For now, Tyler moved his sculpture work to the garage. But Frank doubled down on his mentorship. teaching him more advanced metalworking techniques. Tyler beamed with pride as he completed a new piece, a bird made of mismatched metal scraps. "I call it Hope-a-bird," he said, handing it to Frank. "Do you think it can fly?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Son, this bird will fly farther and higher than you could ever imagine." The turning point came when Susan Walsh overheard something she wasn't meant to hear. Walking past Carmen's house, she caught her voice drifting through an open window during a call. "The old man's more stubborn than I expected," Carmen was saying. "But I've destroyed stronger men than him, starting with my ex-husband. This vendetta ends with that family broken, and if that autistic freak gets hurt in the process, a broken bar, well, accidents happen in construction zones." Susan's blood ran cold. This wasn't about community standards. It never was. This was personal, and Frank Rodriguez had just been handed the proof he needed. This wasn't just business anymore. Carmen was orchestrating something far darker. Susan knew she had to warn Frank, but who would believe the depth of Carmen's malice? The battle was turning deeply personal, and Tyler had unknowingly become the main target of a woman who had already proven she'd crush anyone in her path to revenge. On Monday morning at 6 a.m., Carmen held another so-called emergency home meeting, giving just 18 hours notice via email. Most families were preoccupied with Sunday evening routine as a homework, dinner, bed to meal, so only 7 neighbors managed to attend. Frank arrived 20 minutes late, hair still damp from a rushed shower, and walked in as Carmen was already presenting her case. "As you can see from these photographs," Carmen said, pointing to large prints of Tyler's workspace, "the Rodriguez property has become a magnet for disturbed behavior, traumatizing the neighborhood's normal children." She paused dramatically, letting the words sink in. "This type of industrial activity fosters an environment where abnormal behaviors are not just tolerated but encouraged." A heavy silence followed. The room shifted from curiosity to discomfort. Frank stood, his hands visibly shaking. "Lady, I've lived in this neighborhood since before you were born," he said. "That boy you're talking about has more goodness in his little finger than you have in your whole damn body." But Carmen remained composed, her tone chillingly precise. "Mr. Rodriguez, your grandson's condition presents a public health concern. For the sake of the community's mental hygiene, our children shouldn't be exposed to such abnormal behaviors. It's traumatic during their formative years, and allowing him access to industrial tools unsupervised violates numerous child safety protocols." One mother instinctively pulled her child closer. Ray Thompson dropped his gaze to the floor, rubbing his forehead, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The atmosphere had transformed from mild annoyance to a tense unease. Carmen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was dehumanizing the child. Frank's voice, when he finally spoke again, was dangerously calm. "Mrs. Blackwood, you just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. That boy is my family, and family means everything." Carmen's lips curved into a cold smile. "Sentiment doesn't override community safety." The vote will proceed as scheduled. Later that night, at 11 p.m., Blake Morrison convinced Ray Thompson to join him in what he called sending a stronger message. Ray, already emotionally conflicted, numbed himself with a few beers and listened to Blake's plan to use Carmen's white Ford Explorer to deliver a devastating blow. At 1:30 a.m., Blake slammed the SUV into the corner of Frank's main workshop at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. Sculptures toppled like dominoes, metal shrieked and shattered, and a portion of the roof collapsed, crushing Tyler's workbench, destroying months of healing work in mere seconds. Blake reversed the SUV, leaned out the window, and shouted, "This is your final warning, old man. Keep that weird kid away from normal people or next time, we won't be so gentle." Ray sat in stunned silence, staring at the wreckage they'd caused. The weight of their actions hit him like a hammer to the chest. Tyler's sanctuary was in ruins. Awakened by the crash, Tyler ran outside barefoot. His eyes scanned the destruction his sculptures lay scattered like broken dreams. But he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stood there, paralyzed. Then, suddenly, he hurled his favorite metalwork hammer to the floor and bolted inside, slamming his bedroom door so hard the windows rattled. Danny found him curled in his closet, rocking back and forth, making the low humming sound he used when the world became too much. His hands clutched the jagged remains of a ruined sculpture, blood dripping from his palms where the sharp metal had cut deep, though he didn't seem to notice. Frank sat beside him on the floor in silence for over an hour, breathing slowly, matching Tyler's rhythm until the boy's panic gave way to sheer exhaustion and sleep. When Frank finally stood and looked around at the devastation, he said nothing. He began collecting every shattered piece, his mind focused not on repairs, but on something far more permanent. Blake calling Tyler weird had triggered something in Frank. This was no longer about HOA rules or zoning laws. This was about protecting his grandson from people who viewed compassion as weakness, from predators who mistook vulnerability for something disposable. Danny called 911. But the response was exactly what Frank had expected. Officer Henderson arrived 45 minutes later and immediately started explaining why the case would be hard to prosecute without witnesses. The responding officer shook his head with a practiced sigh. This looks like random vandalism and no clear suspects, no witnesses. Could have been drunk teenagers, maybe a prank gone wrong. Best you can do is file an insurance claim and install some better lighting. But Susan Walsh had been reviewing their security footage and uncovered something disturbing. There was deliberate signal interference, she said. All our cameras went dark from exactly 1 a.m. to 2 o'clock a.m. The exact window of the attack. Someone used jamming equipment to blind the property. Danny clenched his jaw. Funny how the cameras just happened to malfunction for 1 hour right when our place was being torn apart. Almost like someone planned it. By morning, the wreckage had drawn a crowd not of gawkers, but of quiet supporters. Neighbors came by to help clear the destruction. Mrs. Patterson brought coffee and sandwiches. Mr. Johnson sorted salvageable metal from the twisted heap. Even local teens showed up with brooms and garbage bags, their usual restlessness replaced by silent anger. The community had seen what happened and they didn't need proof to know it wasn't some prank. At 3 a.m., Ray Thompson found himself outside the dimly lit community church, unable to go inside but too ashamed to return home. In a shaky voice memo he later deleted, he confessed, "Davida broken bar tonight. Your father helped destroy another autistic kid's safe space. I watched his sculptures get crushed. All I could think about was you, and how you'd feel if someone did that to your room, to your things. I don't know how to make this right." Meanwhile, Frank stood alone in the gutted workshop, his fingers brushing over the cold steel of the one machine left untouched, the industrial metal crusher. It hummed silently, capable of compressing an entire car into a cube. 30 years crushing scrap, he murmured. Never recycled anything worth more than a couple $100. But maybe it's time this machine tried something new. Tyler's recovery was slow and painful. The boy who once found peace in crafting beauty from chaos now refused to set foot in the place that had brought him calm. Even after repairs, Tyler would stop at the workshop door, frozen, trembling. The trauma had rewired something inside him. He stopped sculpting. Instead, he began covering his bedroom door with warning signs. Little handwritten notes started showing up around the house. "Stay away from my family." Danny tried everything: therapy, medication, comforter, but the nightmares continued. Tyler would wake up screaming about metal crashing and voices shouting. Frank, silently observing his grandson's decline, came to a decision. Enough waiting, time to act. Some people confuse patience for weakness. Let's remind them there's a difference. Ray Thompson was unraveling. His guilt became a shadow that haunted every step. He began writing unsent letters, confessions he'd burn or tear up, and then, quietly, he started recording Carmina at first for protection, but as her true agenda revealed itself, Ray realized just how deep the rot went. He uncovered a $15 million deal between Carmen and Sunset Development Corporation. Her cut, $4.50 million, enough to restore her status after the divorce. Carmen wasn't just removing competition, she was systematically erasing small businesses, using harassment, lawsuits, and fear to buy up land at a discount. Frank's wasn't the first. It was just the one that fought back. When Susan started questioning Ray's erratic behavior, he nearly confessed. But fear stopped him, a fear of losing his son if the truth came out. Frank's own digging finally unearthed the root of Carmen's hatred. 10 years earlier, A bribery scandal had destroyed Judge Harold Harrison's career. The judge had accepted cash from construction companies in exchange for favorable zoning. The man who exposed him? Frank Rodriguez. While doing metal work on a courthouse renovation, Frank had discovered the evidence that led to the judge's downfall. The judge's wife, Carmen Harrison, and now Carmen Blackwood, she had lost everything: a $2.3 million estate, her social standing, and her children's trust funds. All because of Frank's testimony. This wasn't about zoning disputes or HOAs. It was revenge, nurtured over a decade. Susan helped Frank dig further. Carmen was drowning in legal bills, credit card debt, and foreclosure threats. The home she lived in now wasn't a trophy, it was what was left of her mother's legacy. Then Carmen struck again. A certified letter arrived demanding $18,500 in accrued fines, plus an additional $2,000 penalty for safety hazards. The letter cited structural damage her own accomplices had caused. But it was the final line that made Frank's blood run cold. Disguised as a legal note of concern, it warned, "Children with unstable behavior pose a long-term threat to the safety of our community. We recommend exploring alternative living arrangements before further action becomes necessary." Frank unfolded the latest letter from Carmen Blackwood with steady hands, reading it once, then twice, then a third time. His face darkened with each pass. The message was couched in formal language but dripping with veiled cruelty. "Your grandson would be much better off in a professionally supervised residential facility, designed specifically for children with his special needs, where trained staff can ensure his safety and development." Carefully, Frank folded the letter and filed it away in his growing collection of evidence. Danny, watching his father's reaction, felt a chill run down his spine. That expression of focused, calm, and cold was the same one Frank wore the morning after the workshop was destroyed. "Dad, what are you planning?" Danny asked. Frank's reply came without hesitation, quiet and ominous. "I'm not planning anything, son. I'm just waiting for the right opportunity." That opportunity seemed to begin revealing itself when Tyler, without telling anyone, began working in secret. In the quiet of the garage during the hours when Carmen's surveillance crews weren't watching, he pieced together scraps of metal left behind from the wreckage. After 3 weeks, he presented his creation to Frank, a sculpture titled "Phoenix Rising from Broken Things." "Grandpa," Tyler said simply, "I think things that get broken can sometimes come back stronger, more beautiful, like us." Tears welled in Frank's eyes. In that moment, Tyler had given him two priceless gifts: forgiveness, and permission. The Phoenix sculpture became more than art, it became a symbol, a declaration that destruction could be a beginning. Quietly, Frank began making preparations. What looked like ordinary maintenance to anyone else was actually a calculated strategy. He serviced the metal crusher completely, flushing its hydraulic systems, running stress tests, checking emergency shutoffs. He reviewed state laws on abandoned vehicles, discovering that with proper notice, a property owner could legally dispose of any car left on their land. And he observed Carmen. Her life ran like clockwork: coffee at 7 a.m., HOA business from 8 to 10, phone meetings with Sunset Development at 9 p.m. Frank knew machines and people ran on patterns. Carmen Blackwood had just become his most important project. The chapter closed with Frank alone in the workshop, standing before his freshly tuned metal crusher. The Phoenix sculpture watched silently from a nearby shelf. Frank spoke softly, more to the machine than to himself. 30 years of crushing scrap metal, broken appliances, and garbage. Never once got to recycle something that started its life as luxury. But every machine deserves a chance to reach its true potential. And some people broken bar need to learn what happens when consequences catch up. 2 days later, the final blow came. A sheriff's deputy arrived at the Rodriguez property with grim formality, delivering an official notice. "Mr. Rodriguez, you have exactly 48 hours to settle your fines. If not, your property will be seized and auctioned to recover damages." Tyler heard everything from inside the bedroom closet. Trembling, he listened as Carmen's voice echoed from the living room. "Special children belong in special facilities with proper supervision. Not playing with dangerous equipment unsupervised." Danny's temper snapped. "Get out of our house. You've done enough to my son." he shouted. But Frank didn't raise his voice. His calm unnerved everyone present. Meanwhile, Blake Morrison, giddy with victory, dragged Ray Thompson out for what he called a celebration, a night of drinks and cards at the Riverside Casino. Carmen had loaned them her white Ford Explorer, insisting it was official HOA business. Blake boasted all evening about the $5,000 bonus Carmen promised once the Rodriguez family was gone. After this weekend, we're splitting development money while that old man and his weird grandson become someone else's problem, he laughed. Downing his sixth beer, Ray tried to drown out the memory of Tyler's destroyed sculptures, but it wasn't working. In every glass of whiskey, he saw his son's fascia David asking why he had hurt a boy just like him. At 2:30 a.m., Blake made a drunken, catastrophic decision. We need to send a message before the city takes the place, he slurred. Let's end this with a grand finale. Despite Ray's weak protests, Blake got behind the wheel of Carmen's SUV, floored the accelerator, and drove straight into the heart of Frank's workshop. At 3 a.m. sharp, the vehicle slammed through the building, crashing into the main workbench and embedding itself deep inside. Support beams collapsed. Sparks danced as the power cut out. Tyler's remaining sculptures, his final works, were obliterated. But this time, something was different. The SUV was stuck. The crash had destroyed the vehicle's electrical system. The engine wouldn't start. The body was lodged tightly between steel beams, making it impossible to remove without professional towing gear. Panic seized Blake. We've gotta run. Leave the car. Carmen will fix it, he screamed. Both men fled into the nearby woods, leaving behind the smoking wrecker and a mountain of incriminating evidence. Exactly what Frank had been waiting for. Frank and Danny had been jolted awake by the sound of the crash. They rushed outside to find Carmen's luxury SUV embedded like a trophy in the middle of the destroyed workshop. Danny reached for his phone. I'm calling the police. But Frank stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The last time we called the police, they treated us like suspects, Frank said quietly. This time a broken bar, we do it by the book, legally and permanently. Then, like a man inspecting an old friend, Frank circled the wrecked vehicle, his face unreadable, his mind already at work. Frank meticulously inspected the damage, capturing photographs from every angle and carefully documenting the exact position of the SUV well within the boundaries of his private property. The moment Blake and Ray fled the scene, the vehicle had become legally abandoned under state law, granting Frank the right to dispose of it after proper notice. Over the next 2 hours, Frank moved with deliberate, measured precision. Every step was calculated, every action fully compliant with regulations he had studied weeks in advance. He photographed the extensive structural damage to the workshop and Tyler's now destroyed work area. Then, following state requirements, he printed and affixed a bold notice to the SUV's windshield: abandoned vehicle A to be scrapped. The 2-hour notice clock began ticking. With calm determination, Frank used his industrial crane to gently reposition the SUV fully inside the workshop, ensuring the entire process occurred on private land, every inch within his legal rights as a property owner and victim of vandalism. When the time came, Frank activated the hydraulic system of his metal crusher like a priest beginning a sacred ritual. The massive steel arms responded with flawless mechanical grace as they descended on $80,000 worth of privilege and malice. The leather seats were the first to collapse, followed by the dashboard, touchscreen panels, and climate control system that had once cocooned Carmen in comfort and superiority. From the doorway, Tyler watched in silent awe, not frightened, but mesmerized at witnessing a pure and perfect expression of justice in motion. The crushing process took exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds. Frank monitored every pressure gauge and system response with the focus of a master craftsman. When the hydraulics finally fell still, what had once been a gleaming white SUV was now a 3-foot cube of compressed steel and twisted aluminum, destined to become the base for a bench in the community garden. Frank stood in the quiet, pre-dawn stillness, breathing in the peace of a neighborhood unaware that justice had just been served, not in courtrooms, but with cold steel and 30 years of experience. At 8 a.m., Blake Morrison and Ray Thompson returned to the Rodriguez property expecting to retrieve Carmen's SUV. What they found instead was the battered remains of Frank's workshop and a neat, orderly stack of identical metal cubes. Blake's eyes widened in disbelief as he stumbled forward, his voice rising in panic. "Where the hell is Carmen's car?" Ray didn't answer. He stood frozen, overtaken by a crushing realization. Frank hadn't just retaliated, he had redefined the entire playing field. This wasn't chaos, it was transformation, executed with brutal elegance. From the shadows of the workshop, Frank emerged calmly, wiping his hands on a clean towel as if he just finished a minor repair. He addressed the two men with serene politeness. "Gentlemen," he said, "can I help you find something? I was just clearing out some scrap left by vandals." Tyler stepped beside his grandfather, gazing up at the neatly stacked cubes with a glint of admiration. "Grandpa," he said softly, "those blocks look like perfect building pieces for something beautiful." Frank looked at his grandson and smiled deeply, contentedly. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a builder again. "Exactly right, son," Frank said, placing a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Sometimes, destruction becomes the raw material for creation." Carmen Blackwood just made a generous donation to a community improvement project, though she doesn't know it yet. Carmen's discovery that her $80,000 Ford Explorer had vanished triggered a meltdown loud enough to be heard 3 blocks away. Her screams tore through the morning air as she berated Blake Morrison over the phone, while neighbors peeked from porches, drawn by the commotion. "What do you mean it's gone?" she shrieked. "You left an $80,000 vehicle in a junkyard and now it's missing?" Moments later, Blake and Ray returned to Frank's property, barely holding themselves together as they scoured the damaged workshop like desperate men hunting for a lifeline. Frank watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement, like someone watching children search for Easter eggs. "Mr. Rodriguez," Blake blurted out, panic flooding his voice. "There was a white SUV here this morning." "Where is it?" Frank tilted his head slightly, as if trying to recall. "SUV? I haven't seen any vehicles today, gentlemen. Just some scrap metal I had to clear out after the vandalism. Would you like some coffee?" Tyler baked fresh cookies this morning. 15 minutes later, Carmen arrived in her backup Mercedes, storming across the property like a thundercloud in heels. Her fury was palpable, sending children scurrying behind their parents as she shouted, "Where is my vehicle?" Her carefully polished mask of control finally cracked, revealing the panic underneath. Frank, unbothered, greeted her with the same calm composure. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said gently, "I'm not sure what vehicle you're referring to. As you can see, there are no cars here, just the usual stack of recycled metal I use for community projects." Carmen's eyes narrowed as they locked onto the row of neatly compressed metal cubes. Something about the faint white specks of paint on their surfaces triggered a horrifying suspicion. "These blocks of broken bar," she said slowly, stepping closer. "They look a broken bar familiar." "What are they?" Frank beamed with pride. "Scrap metal, perfect for construction or public art. I cleaned up some material left behind by whoever vandalized my shop. Would you like to see the paperwork for my recycling business?" 30 minutes later, Officer Henderson arrived in response to Carmen's frantic report of a stolen $85,000 SUV, but after a thorough inspection, he found nothing unusual, just a tidy lot, a polite elderly man, and a stack of processed metal. "Mr. Rodriguez," the officer began, flipping through his notepad, "Mrs. Blackwood claims a Ford Explorer was abandoned on your property after last night's incident. Did you see such a vehicle?" Frank nodded politely. "Officer, as you can see, my property was damaged last night. I cleaned up some debris this morning, a standard business practice, but no vehicles were here when I began. Just scrap." Frank handed over licenses, permits, and logs of his recycling operation. Henderson inspected the metal cubes but found nothing suspicious. They were, indeed, just recycled material. Meanwhile, Carmen's insistence that her vehicle had been turned into those cubes began to sound less like an accusation and more like a breakdown. Her voice rose, shrill and frantic, her words tangled in desperation. Ray Thompson, unable to bear the guilt any longer, quietly pulled Frank aside. "Mr. Rodriguez," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I need to tell you the truth. Blake and I were driving the SUV. We crashed it into your shop and ran like cowards. That vehicle broken bar, it was Carmen's." Frank listened with measured silence, nodding as Ray confessed everything. When he finished, Frank spoke softly. "Son, I appreciate your honesty, but I'm not sure what SUV you're talking about. All I saw this morning was some metal that needed processing after the vandalism. You look tired, son. Are you sleeping okay?" Ray stood there, stunned. How could an $80,000 SUV vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a few blocks of white-specked metal? The emotional climax came when Tyler, still shaken by the weeks of trauma, approached Carmen with a sculpture he had made. It was a small, abstract bird crafted from pieces of her former SUV, its wings stretched upward in a symbol of hope. "I made this for the community garden," Tyler said quietly. "Grandpa says broken things can become beautiful if someone cares enough to fix them." Carmen stared at the sculpture, her face twisting with rage. Rather than show gratitude or remorse, she raised her hand and slapped the sculpture from the boy's hands. Tyler's sculpture slipped from his hands and shattered against the ground, fragments scattering like fallen feathers. Carmen Blackwood had struck it away with disgust. "I don't want garbage art from freaks," she snapped, her voice sharp with cruelty. "That metal belongs to me, and I'll prove it." Tyler didn't cry from the sting of her words or the loss of his sculpture, but from the deeper pain of realizing that some people destroy beauty simply because they can. The crowd, including Officer Henderson, stood frozen in stunned silence. They had just witnessed Carmen lash out at a disabled child, exposing the venom behind her carefully polished facade. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. With eerie calm, he knelt beside the shattered artwork and began gathering each piece, his hands steady while his eyes burned with cold fury. When he finally rose, facing Carmen, his voice was low and unwavering. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Nobody, and I mean nobody, hurts my grandson and walks away without consequences." He stepped forward, and the weight behind his words was palpable. "You want to know what happened to your SUV? Tomorrow night, when the neighborhood meets to vote on your little removal hearing, I think they're going to hear some very interesting facts about the kind of person you really are, and what you've been plotting to do to families like mine." Carmen's face turned ashen. The man she once dismissed as a fragile old nuisance now stood before her as something far more dangerous, a protector with nothing left to lose. Her time was running out. The following evening, the so-called emergency tribunal convened at the Willowbrook Heights Community Center. It was part home meeting, part show trial, complete with rented tables, dramatic lighting, and printed agendas. Item 1. Permanent removal of the Rodriguez family from the neighborhood. Carmen had dressed like a prosecutor, cloaked in a sharp black suit and fake authority. Her confidence, bloated by fear tactics and backroom promises, swelled as she looked out over the packed room. The audience was tired of threats, tired of the division, tired of the conflict Carmen had cultivated like a garden of weeds. Frank Rodriguez entered quietly, accompanied by Susan Walsh with a thick folder of legal evidence, Antonio Garcia with financial records, and Channel 7 reporter Rebecca Stonia, whose arrival sent visible ripples of panic through several HOA board members. Carmen took the floor with a speech soaked in righteous manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of Willowbrook Heights," she began, her voice rising with practiced drama, "we must choose between the safety of our normal children and the selfish demands of a family who refuses to acknowledge the dangers they've introduced." She gestured to images of Tyler's sculptures and Frank's workshop as though presenting a criminal dossier. "The Rodriguez property has become a magnet for disturbing behavior. It endangers our children, lowers our property values, and harbors an unstable individual whose presence threatens the emotional well-being of every child in this neighborhood. I move for the immediate and permanent removal of the Rodriguez family before their recklessness causes irreversible harm." Frank rose slowly. He opened Susan's folder and removed a set of documents, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "before this community decides the fate of my family, I believe everyone here deserves to hear the truth about what's really been going on in this neighborhood, and why you've worked so hard to destroy us." What came next would unravel Carmen's empire of lies more thoroughly than any lawsuit ever could. The room fell silent as Frank unveiled security footage showing Blake Morrison deliberately ramming Carmen's SUV into the Rodriguez workshop. Clear on the audio was Blake shouting threats about keeping that weird kid away from normal people. Ray Thompson, who had been sitting quietly in the back wrestling with his conscience, suddenly stood up, tears streaming down his face. "It's true," he admitted. "I was there. Carmen Blackwood ordered us to terrorize this family. I took part in destroying a disabled child's safe space. I recorded everything because I knew it was wrong, and I couldn't live with the guilt anymore." Susan Walsh then presented financial documents that flipped the room's mood from uneasy cooperation to explosive outrage. Neighbors realized their HOA fees had been siphoned off to fuel Carmen's personal vendetta. "Carmen Blackwood has embezzled $47,000 from our community funds in the past 18 months, Susan announced, opening boxes filled with receipts and bank statements. $23,000 went to personal expenses, spa treatments, designer clothes, luxury vacations. $15,000 paid kickbacks to Sunset Development Corporation for insider property deals. $9,000 bought the SUV used for a community patrol, but it's registered in Carmen's name and only used for her private errands." Angry voices erupted. Neighbors were furious to learn that what they believed was funding community improvements had actually supported Carmen's lavish lifestyle, all while she terrorized families and schemed to profit from destroying their neighborhood. From across the room, Mrs. Patterson stood, her voice shaking with rage. "You stole our money to buy the car you used to attack a child's workshop. What kind of monster are you?" Frank's final piece of evidence stunned the crowd and revealed the true, personal nature of Carmen's vendetta. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said calmly, holding up a 10-year-old newspaper clipping about Judge Harold Harrison's corruption trial. "I was the anonymous whistleblower who exposed your husband's bribery scheme. That evidence sent him to prison, destroyed your marriage, and ended your luxury lifestyle built on stolen money. This campaign against my family, the threats, the harassment of my autistic grandson, the deliberate destruction of our property, it isn't about zoning or community standards. It's personal revenge against the man who brought your family's crimes to light." Neighbors stared at Frank in shock, finally grasping the depths of Carmen's obsession and the courage it took for him to come forward. Knowing the risks, Carmen's facade crumbled spectacularly. "Yes," she screamed, her voice raw with hatred and entitlement. "You destroyed my life, my marriage, my children's future, my social standing, everything I worked for. I lived in a $2.3 million mansion, and you reduced me to this pathetic neighborhood with ordinary people. I deserve that lifestyle. I earned it. When I found out you were living here like nothing had happened, I decided to make you suffer just like I did. If that autistic freak got hurt in the process, collateral damage. Justice demanded it." The room recoiled in horror at Carmen's utter lack of remorse for terrorizing a disabled child. Several parents instinctively moved their children away from her as if her hatred might infect them. Rebecca Stone's news cameras had captured everything. Sheriff's deputies entered the community center, warrants in hand, ready to act on Ray Thompson's confession and Susan Walsh's financial evidence. "Carmen Blackwood, you are under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, harassment of a disabled minor, and destruction of property," the lead deputy announced, reading her Miranda rights as Carmen screamed about injustice and revenge. The community vote was unanimous. Carmen was permanently banned from any HOA leadership. Antonio Garcia was appointed interim president. The recovered $47,000 would be dedicated to neighborhood improvements, including a community garden showcasing Tyler's metal sculptures. Blake Morrison vanished overnight, apparently fleeing the state to avoid prosecution. Ray Thompson accepted full responsibility and pledged to work with prosecutors to ensure Carmen faced the harshest penalties. 6 months later, the community garden opening drew over 200 people, including TV reporters and the mayor, who hailed Tyler's Phoenix sculpture as a symbol of transforming trauma into triumph. Children who once avoided Tyler now sought lessons in metalwork, their parents eager to make amends for past prejudices. Former supporters of Carmen quietly apologized to Frank, admitting fear had kept them silent but promising never to let cruelty go unchecked again. Tyler blossomed into a leader, guiding other special needs children through the healing power of art. Turning discarded metal into beauty, his workshop became a model program copied by schools across the state. The boy who once hid from hostile voices now spoke confidently at community events, Broken things aren't garbage, they're chances to build something better. Willowbrook Heights was reborn. Tyler had not only healed but become a symbol of resilience and hope. His masterpiece, a magnificent phoenix forged from the crushed metal of Carmen's SUV, stood at the center of the community garden, a plaque reading, "In honor of transformation, a turning destruction into beauty." Frank's workshop had been rebuilt and expanded, a teaching center where Tyler helped others discover the therapeutic magic of creativity. Meanwhile, Carmen Blackwood served 3 to 5 years in state prison, her appeals denied, her threats reduced to impotent rage behind bars. Ray Thompson, having made full restitution and dedicated himself to mentoring troubled youth, was accepted back into the community as redemption earned through genuine action, not empty words. One quiet evening, Frank and Tyler sat beside the Phoenix sculpture, watching the sunset paint its metal feathers in gold and crimson. "Grandpa," Tyler asked softly, "do you think Mrs. Blackwood knows her car became something beautiful?" Frank smiled, adjusting Tyler's collar gently. "Son, some people spend their lives trying to destroy beautiful things because they're broken inside and can't stand to see others find happiness. But the most beautiful revenge is turning their destruction into something magnificent that lasts forever." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, then added with quiet wisdom, "I hope someday she learns that creating things is better than breaking them." Frank chuckled softly. "That's why you're going to change the world, and not through revenge, but through forgiveness and the courage to keep building beauty, even when others try to tear it down." As the last light faded, the Phoenix sculpture caught the streetlights, glowing with a fire all its own, a lasting reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things rise from the ashes of hatred, transformed by love into something eternal and unbreakable.